Professor Chatterjee, what a pleasure to meet you in person. So rarely do I actually do in-person interviews these days. For people who have no idea what we're about to talk about, because this is a very new topic, and it's a very new topic for my podcast, but I think in the world in general, and a topic that needs to be had. Dr. Chatterjee, please explain, how would you like to describe who you are?
Who am I? First of all, thank you for coming, making the trip, and doing this in person. I much prefer to talk to people in person than across a digital screen, so it's delightful that way. I am a neurologist and a cognitive neuroscientist. I work here at the University of Pennsylvania, where we are both sitting. I have been a cognitive neuroscientist for maybe close to 40 years, and along the way, just to step back, cognitive neuroscience is trying to understand the nature of the human mind as implemented in the brain. And within that, for about 25 years, I've been interested in the nature of aesthetic experiences as something that is fundamental and core to what humans do. We tend to value aesthetic experiences of different kinds, and surprisingly, it had not been a real focus of scientific inquiry. So that's how I got interested in it. And in 2018, we formed the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics, which is, to my knowledge, the first research lab dedicated to the neuroscience of aesthetic experiences.
So let's talk a little bit more generally.
Mm-hmm.
The notion of mind versus brain and consciousness. Because what we're going to focus in on, of course, is the mind at this point, even though we're talking about neuro and brain somehow, as I understand it. How do you qualify or define these three components?
So the three components are the mind, the brain, and consciousness.
Yeah.
Right? I think of the mind as implemented in this organ. Right? This is the nature of our mind. The mind, or the brain, interacts with the environment in a variety of ways. I think you can't, in my own view, it's very hard to come up with a mind without a brain. So it's materialist in that sense. Having said that, a term that philosophers sometimes use about one thing supervening on the other, meaning that it is grounded in something, but it's not entirely explained by it. But for us, the brain is the vehicle by which to ask questions about the mind. Consciousness, I think, also depends on how you define it, right? Is it consciousness of? Is it self-conscious? And those kind of definitions matter. I started my career examining people with focal brain damage that produced various non-intuitive observations of consciousness. So there is a disorder called spatial neglect, which is when people have damage, particularly to the right side of their brain, particularly to the right parietal cortex more often than not, that might act as though the entire left side of space doesn't exist, or even the left side of their body is not theirs. And because their language circuits are relatively preserved, they can talk about it. So you can talk to them and you can run experiments. And I've had people who insist the left side of their body is not their own. I've held it in front of them, say, well, whose body is this? They say it's yours. I say, well, I have brown skin. They agree to that. This is white skin, but nonetheless, they can't be dissuaded from this idea that what I'm holding in front of them is my body, not theirs. So, and these are not people who are delusional in a classic sense, right? They haven't had a history of mental health issues, and those kinds of observations raise questions of what is the nature of consciousness. I've studied people who have damage to their occipital cortex and are blind for all purposes and have no awareness that they're blind, right? So those are the kinds of phenomena as how I started my career, trying to understand the nature of consciousness in that specific context. What are we conscious of? How are we conscious of space? How are we conscious of the nature of input that is coming into us? How are we aware of ourselves, our own bodies?
So it really puts into question the concept of reality.
It puts into question the concept of our representation of reality, right? So physicists will talk about reality in a very different way, right? But for us, it is really, what is our version of reality as it gets funneled through our sensory systems, through our knowledge systems, to the way our brains are organized, right? There are certain aspects of reality we know exist that we have no access to. So for example, if we think about vision, our visual systems, our retinas, are sensitive to a certain degree of electromagnetic radiation, and things under that and above that are not part of our everyday reality, but we know it exists.
In today's world, the idea of beauty, when you talked about the individual who couldn't understand the left side, beauty, which is central to what you're studying with neuroaesthetics, but not only because it's art, it's a mirror of us as well at some level. What does it say about us to study beauty?
Yeah. Well, beauty, at least culturally, seems to go in and out of fashion among academics, right? So there's a period where in the world of art, people think that beauty is passé, and I'm told by artists, friends of mine, that, for example, in art school for a while, one couldn't speak about beauty. It was too naive or too simplistic or whatever. Having said that, I think that we are drawn to beauty and have always been drawn to beauty, and we also have a decorative impulse. You can go back as far as we have evidence of humans making artifacts, that even things like early tools, Acheulean tools, people who are expert in that comment about the fact that these tools are made to be more than just functional, that there is a visual form that it takes that seems to be aesthetically appealing. And so we have this co-occurrence, sometimes tension, between efficiency and productivity and something else, and that something else often is beauty, and that something else is often a vehicle in which to have a certain set of experiences that we value, and we find ourselves driven to want to both create and want to experience. And really, what is that? The mystery of that is what, to me, is endlessly fascinating. As someone who studies the human mind, the human experience, what is that, right? Why do we care?
And where does it lodge? You talked about the left brain and the right brain. Of course, as we know, that's not exactly how it goes down.
Yeah.
There's this definition that we've sort of galvanized, brought around for everybody to believe there's left and right.
Yeah.
You talk about that. Where does one understand the beauty in the mind, and to what extent is that something that animals might or might not have?
Yeah.
Because personally, if I'm looking at nature and seeing a beautiful sunset,
Yeah.
while I may not, as an animal, dream about it,
Yeah.
I feel like even an animal must recognize something magnificent. They recognize things more like survival issues,
Yeah.
fire, danger, maybe. But is this something that is only human, or do you think that something possibly could be in an animal as well?
I think every time we think there is something uniquely human, over time we get disabused of this notion. So
The delusion of grandeur.
The delusion of grandeur, that we are the center of everything.
Yeah,
right?
We're the best.
We're the best. We are all of that. So I think the null hypothesis, which is how we talk about sort of our default assumptions, is that there are continuities with the animal world, and then there might be certain things where certain things change. So language might be a good example, right? So animals can communicate, they make noises, some communicate in more complex ways. But there is something about the human ability to create symbols, and in this case words, and concatenate them and generate them that take something of which there are elements in other animals, but the consequences of that can be quite vast, right? So we build these kinds of structures and build cities and build extraordinary things in a way that you might say a beaver builds a dam or a termite builds a mound, and certainly these are themselves architectural marvels, but uh, they're still not quite of the scale and complexity that we are capable of. And so then do you say, is there a continuity, or is there something qualitatively different? And then you get into the details of what that might mean.
There are many things. My brain is sort of going berserk on the number of thoughts that are coming in. In your book, you describe, you talk a lot about two animals in particular, and I have to read them. The Bengalese finch,
Yeah.
so perhaps a hat tip to that, and the white-rumped mania, which these are the
Munia,
two.
I think.
Munia,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
I actually read the audiobook, so I had to then transcribe.
Right. Yeah.
But in this notion of reflections with regard to animals, for you, in writing the book, to what extent was the discovery or research around the mind and the animal interesting to you, relevant to you, and impacted the way the book turned out?
One of the things about writing that book, is that there are a set of ideas I had that I wanted to cohere, and there were things going on in the field that felt maybe needed to be pulled together. But in the act of writing, you also discover what you think.
Right.
Right.
Because the words are structuring.
Right.
You
The
have to
words
put
are
it down.
right. And I think I may be not getting this exactly right, but Mark Twain, I think, once said, "How do I know what I'm thinking until I see what I'm saying?" Right. And so there is a kind of almost a path of discovery as you're writing, even though you might have a broad sense of where you want to go. And in this book, I didn't know where I was going to end up. And this whole question where the white-rumped munia and the Bengalese finch came was trying to understand not beauty per se, but art. And how do we even think about art? Is art a natural kind? And on the face of it, it seems as though art is a cultural construct that really came out of a certain period in Europe, where these became these artifacts that were given this special property that they needed to be in their own places and museums. Maybe they were, in rich people's homes or in royalty, but there's a kind of aura given to works of art that up until that time, and still in most of the world, is just part of people's everyday lives. And so this idea that is art a natural kind, and by natural kind I mean as contrast to looking at people or looking at nature, and the question of whether you are looking at an African mask or a Rembrandt portrait or a porcelain urinal, are these actually the same thing, right? We give them the same word, and on the face of it, it seems like they're not the same thing.
I would just say I was laughing because I was thinking of porcelain from Limoges, something beautiful Chinese porcelain vase, but no, a porcelain urinal. I was
well,
great.
I mean, as you know, and so we're in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Museum of Art has one of these Duchamp urinals, and some people think it may have been the most significant work of art in the 20th century. So critics will claim that, and so, but so the question was, how do we think of art as an expression of an impulse, an instinct, or is it something else? And that, to me, the question, which has been in the literature, perhaps was the wrong question. because it's predicated on the idea that art is one thing, and then we can then talk about what art is. Is it this or is it that? Perhaps I thought the better question might be, under what conditions does this artifact that we call art really an expression of an instinct, and under what circumstances is this artifact that we also call art actually something else? And so that was the strategy to try to understand that. And this is where the Bengalese finch and the white Ramunia became of interest, because the basic idea is that there is this wild type finch that a group of Japanese collectors started to collect and then started to breed. But instead of breeding as determined by the nature of the song, the bird's song, which is what happens in the wild, now they're being artificially bred for their plumage, the way they physically look, and so the song no longer has the same survival value that it does in the wild. And so the question is, what happens to its song? On the one hand, you could think it would just degenerate and wouldn't matter, but that's not what happens. It turns out that the songs become more complex, they become more socially responsive, and they have a very different kind of structure. And in birds, we know a fair amount about the neuroscience of their brains and how it's structured, and it turns out that the implementation of these songs in the Bengalese finch, which are more varied, more responsive to their social environment, is also more distributed. And so the argument is that, using by analogy in the songs, that here's one kind of song, we're calling them bird songs, we're not calling them different things, one that is more stereotypic, that is responsive to certain environmental pressures, and here's another kind of thing that we're also calling a bird song, that when those selection pressures are released, there's a kind of freedom and opening up of it. And so the question was, is that an analogy that works with art, which is when, again, put this in a European context, when art was really determined by the church or by royalty, there are certain ground rules and certain things it had to maintain, and once it's released from those kinds of cultural selection pressures, it's allowed to expand. And so you can get a urinal, you can get a black square, you can get all these things that now we call art, and they're challenging because they're responsive to local cultural features. And so just because you might have a certain experience in an educated class in an urban American or urban London or urban Paris doesn't necessarily mean that people in different parts of the world or without the education or background are going to have the same experience.
So just to translate for me, what I was listening to, what I was hearing was that birds would have plumage that was very non-distinct, nondescript, and their song was the beauty that attracted their sexual partner.
Yeah.
Because in your book you talk about natural and sexual selection being these instincts that we have, and you, of course, you vie for a third path. That when we're talking here is the context within which any art is the judger somehow of its value, and that in a less constrained world we end up with more freedom in the expression of that art.
Yes. We end up with more freedom in the expression of it, and along with that, the more complexity in its interpretation.
So when we break down concepts of beauty, or I'm not going to say art, but beauty, you say in the book that people have a generally same idea with regard to nature and faces, human faces, but it varies more widely anyway, when it comes to art and beauty. One of the things that I have been writing and looking at is this, trying to understand to what extent it's maybe this is the question, how do you feel your book is with regard to the idea that everything is beautiful, everyone is beautiful?
I mean, there's a way in which we would like to believe that, and it sort of, in some ways, flattens the idea, right? If everybody's beautiful, then
there's no beauty.
There's no beauty,
Yeah.
right? So I think they're, in the same way that we don't say everybody is the same height, right?
Same skin color.
Same skin color, right? So there's variability, and there's something desirable about that kind of diversity. Now, one of the areas that we are interested in is the way in which the connection between aesthetic and moral values.
Mm-hmm.
And this I didn't touch on a lot in the book, but this idea that we are very good at discriminating between objects, but we are not very good at discriminating values, different kinds of values. And so there is this notion that physically attractive people are imbued with attractive moral characteristics,
mm-hmm.
that they are more intelligent, more competent, more trustworthy, warmer, all of this. One of the unfortunate consequences of that conflation, which since the book we've been investigating a fair amount, is there is also facial anomaly is bad stereotype that seems to be built in. So people who have scars or developmental abnormalities or burns, other people frequently think that they are less intelligent, less warm, less trustworthy, and so on. And so that's an instance where you have one set of values that are variable, another set of values that are variable, and they get conflated in problematic ways. And we think culture plays a huge role in this. We have a recent paper showing, so let me step back. We know something about the neural implementation of this kind of response. We did a study in Tanzania with the hunter-gatherer tribe to look at this, and we find that they, as best you can tell, because it's not easy to do experiments in the field like that, as best we can tell, they don't have the same stereotypes that every other population we have looked at, which got us to thinking about, well, how is culture really posing this and writing this into our brains, because we know it's written into our modern Western brains, or brains in this culture. So we think that the stories we tell end up becoming very important. And we looked at the last 40 years of Hollywood movies and 20 years of Bollywood movies, and did this whole analysis of heroes and villains, and we showed that it is the case that heroes or villains are often shown with certain kinds of scars that are more prominent, and they're particularly around the central part of the face where we tend to tend. Whereas heroes, if they have scars, they're kind of off to the side, the forehead. Humphrey Bogart had a scar there, and things like that. And so one thing, and this is a message we give our kids. So the Lion King is a perfect example. Right?
Scarface.
Scarf, right? It's like we don't even have to, the poor guy doesn't even get a name, right? So I think we've gotten more interested in how it is that these cultural tropes, Star Wars, Darth Vader becomes Darth Vader at the time that he gets a scar in his face, right? There are these kind of cultural myths that we get, that we are fed, and it kind of, it gets imbued in our thinking of the way in which aesthetic values and moral values are conflated in problematic ways, and we emphasize that in the contemporary mythology, which is movies.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any material evidence of what storytelling does to our brain?
There are some people that have looked at that. We haven't in any systematic way. I think the general idea is that we are enamored of stories, right? I'm not revealing anything that your listeners don't know.
Definitely true. Definitely true.
Definitely true. But there is an argument, again, an evolutionary argument made that stories expand our experiential repertoire without us having to physically experience it, right? So someone tells you, don't walk down that alley because it's dangerous and bad things are going to happen, right? We're willing to accept that, most of us, as opposed to actually walking down the alley to say, well, let me see if that person is correct. So I think there's this idea that stories allow for a certain kind of transportation, right? It's important for our imagination to be able to put ourselves in a situation that we physically are not in. And under some circumstances, it also is a vehicle for notions of empathy, that you can empathize with certain kinds of characters, you can put yourself in their position. And so I think the stories become a technology to allow for imagination, allow for empathy, allow for perspective taking in a way that expands us from our highly localized experience into something broader and into a shared experience. Culturally becomes a shared experience. It can be a shared experience among friends, and so on.
Well, I mean, the reason why this is important and germane to your book is that we're looking at an artwork, a urinal, and there's a story that we tell ourselves, or is being told to us, and then that story goes in through the ear, presumably, if it's orally said, and then things happen in the brain as a result. And I'm wondering whether we have any evidence of it rewiring the brain, of synapses going off crazy and creating some sort of hormonal reaction. I mean, this is way beyond my pay grade in terms of knowledge of the brain, but it seems important because the interpretation of that art in a context ends up being a story that we tell ourselves, and that is transforming us and also changing us. I'm not going to go down that corridor anymore.
Yeah. In a smaller way, there are some experimental evidence that speaks to what you're bringing up. Those kinds of experiments are very hard to do, just the constraints.
Well, by the way, pretty much everything you're doing in the brain is difficult to do.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a long way to go to understand exactly what's going on up here.
And for your readers, it's worth knowing that, making explicit that experimental science is always incremental, our results are always provisional, right? And you're building a story over time, right? Sometimes non-scientists have this notion of scientists as being very deterministic and very certain about things. It's almost always the case that the certainty comes a couple of layers away from scientists, where people talk about other people's work. So just to be clear, here are things we do know experimentally, that if people are given some contextual information about art, that their appreciation of the art improves. This is especially true in people who have had less exposure to art. We did a study looking at both Americans and people from India, looking at both American art and Indian art, from various measures we have of their judgments of what's going on. And we were asking, is there an in-group bias? Do people from one culture prefer art from their own culture versus the other? What we found was that the people who had more exposure to art had very little, if any, cultural in-group bias. But they were able to generalize beyond the culture and appreciate art in different cultures. People who had the least amount tended to have more of an in-group bias, and that was more true in America than in India, we suspect, because in America people don't really know much about Indian art, but in India people are more likely to know about American art just because of the cultural diffusion.
Yeah.
So, but in both cases, when given more contextual information, that gap decreased. So a little bit of information can go a long way, and the kind of the optimistic view of this is that art, contextualized, can be a way to minimize these kinds of cultural divides, and be another vehicle for communication across cultures, if done well. So that's a kind of optimistic view.
Yeah, because if done well, it makes me think about like history as something we could share together about, and I can explain to you the history of this artwork.
Yeah.
But the narrator, the victor,
Yeah.
is the one
Who
describing
often does the narrating.
and then that's a whole nother can of worms.
So, yes, absolutely. Who gets to tell the story, and what is the story, right? That's a whole other can of worms. But going back to your question, is there anything in the brain that we know about this? And there are the kinds of experiments that have been done are looking at people who have a certain kind of knowledge or expertise as compared to naive people when they're encountering the exact same thing, right? So there's one experiment that was done looking at architectural facades, and the participants were either people who were studying architecture, so senior graduate students versus graduate students in another domain, right? So you've got people who are similar age, similarly involved in some kind of study, but one group has specialized knowledge, or they're gaining specialized knowledge. And what you find is that both groups are responding to beautiful facades and parts of the reward systems in the brain. But architecture students have additional kinds of involvement, and so they are various parts of their medial temporal cortex, where we think memory and meaning are encoded, are also activated. And so we take that as evidence that when people are experiencing something beautiful, if they have knowledge, and wherever that knowledge came from, it could be from stories, it could be stuff that they read, that comes into play as well. And so that's a kind of hard evidence that we see in the brain. Generally, the models we use is something we refer to as the aesthetic triad, which is that our experience of beauty, or any aesthetic experience, is informed by three large-scale systems in the brain. One has to do with the nature of our sensory and motor systems. So going back to the example of our visual system is only sensitive to a certain range of electromagnetic radiation. There might be the most unbelievably beautiful things happening in ultraviolet, but we don't know about it, right? So there's a kind of constraints and guardrails that our sensory and motor systems provide. And then what's the emotional response to that? If it's beauty, there's often pleasure, but it can be more complicated than that. You can have admixtures of anxiety. So when people talk about the sublime or awe, there's always a little bit of anxiety in there, how all of that, what that cocktail of emotions is. And then semantics and meaning, which is the education, our personal backgrounds, our cultural backgrounds, what point in history we happen to be living in, how that overlays on this relationship between sensation and emotion. And so that's the way we try to carve it out and ask questions about what's going on in the brain in the context of an aesthetic encounter.
So one of the burning questions for me has been about, as a subject of much debate in our household, is the idea of absolute beauty. And the one school, the house says that there is such a thing as absolute beauty. How is it possible that anyone going by a sunset overlooking the Pacific Ocean cannot find that just jaw-droppingly awesome? A peacock with their feathers out there. It seems like it's a universal beauty. It's different when it comes to human beings amongst one another. So A, is there such thing as an absolute beauty? And two, do you think it could be, if possible, something that we could define universally?
So the way a scientist thinks about this question is about variance. How much variance is there, right? And so a notion of absolute beauty would say there is zero variance. everybody who sees this is going to have the same experience. That seems extraordinarily unlikely, right? So you can talk about degrees. And so as we've said, that human artifacts, people are more consistent with natural kinds, with human faces, human bodies, with nature than with human artifacts, whether that's art or architecture. This talking about the aesthetic triad, it's also worth pointing out that the kind of semantics meaning piece becomes really important, right? So one could look at an absolutely gorgeous sunset, to use your example, and somebody might think the reason this is so gorgeous is because of the amount of pollution there is in the air and how it's dispersing the light. And so that knowledge is just going to make it not as beautiful as if you were just having a purely sensorial experience.
It's a little bit more utilitarian. It's not some sort of pure aesthetic. There's some benefit to it.
There's some benefit to it, or there's something that's sullying what otherwise is really beautiful. And we can't, our minds are not capable of separating these out at the moment, right? So you have this knowledge. We have a study that was just recently published where we asked the question of, do people's experience of a work of art, does it vary based on what they think they know about the morality of the artist? And the answer is yes, right? So, so I think these things get pulled in, and because we are different from each other, right? We are similar and we are different, right? The differences also influence those experiences, which would make me think that it is extremely unlikely that you will ever have a situation where there is zero variance in people's response to any object, any scene.
Right.
There might be high degree of agreement, but the idea of a pure universal seems unlikely.
I love that answer. It's very illuminating. I have two other areas I want to talk about. One of them is the transcendental values of beauty, goodness, and truth.
Yeah.
To what extent do the other two impact or play a role with regard to an evaluation of beauty?
Yeah. So we touched on beauty and goodness a little bit,
yes,
right? Around the values, and
the moral
values, right? So goodness is about moral values, and that those conflate both in ways that, both in terms of when looking at people, that we impugn certain moral characteristics, and it goes both ways, right? So a good person starts to look more attractive, and we've shown that as well. And I think that comports with most people's experience. The first time you meet someone, you have a certain sense of what they look like, and as you get to know them, you find their personality more attractive and more appealing, or less appealing, and physically they look more attractive or less attractive over time.
Back to our sexual wiring somehow.
Yes.
It's not a sexual relationship, but it's like a
It's
mutuality and
right.
affiliation.
Yes, absolutely. So there is that happening. We have not formally looked at the relationship between beauty and truth, and so my answer is just going to be my intuitions and not grounded in any actual work. I suspect truth is also its own value system that can get conflated with beauty in ways that sometimes make sense and sometimes don't. So there sometimes, among some scientists, there are these notions that a theory must be true because it's beautiful, it's elegant, right? And it's not obvious to me why that should be the case, right? The world can be messy, right? If we're looking at the nature of the world, I don't know why an elegant theory it would be fantastic if things were elegant, but it's not, on first principles, it's not given to me that something that is an elegant explanation of natural phenomena is the right one. So I think, at least the way I think about it is, these are three transcendental pillars of values, and the question becomes less about the world and more about the nature of our minds. And how do those values become conflated?
Well, you mentioned elegant, the elegant universe,
Yeah.
and this notion of messiness. When we look at perfection, there's this Da Vinci ratio, and there's somehow a constant desire amongst certain companies, people, to seek perfection. And yet I have to believe that imperfection, which reflects on who we are as messy, imperfect beings, is why fundamentally imperfect objects are more beautiful than perfect objects.
Yeah, I suspect that's true, and there is a way in which we can empathize with something with slight imperfections a little more.
As opposed to the Scarfaces, who that's totally bad.
That's right.
But the little imperfection, a mole on the cheek,
mole on
whatever.
cheek, a little bit of asymmetry. I mean, one way we see this is there is this notion of symmetry, right? In faces, symmetry, more symmetric faces are generally more attractive. However, given how easy it is to do now with digital technology, you can make absolutely symmetric faces, right, with no deviation. People find that a little weird. They don't know why, but there's just something not right about that. So now you've got absolute perfect symmetry, and there's a kind of an uncanny valley quality to it. People don't say, "Oh, this is really beautiful."
Well, I'm thinking also on the other side of that scale, broken windows. The idea of if there were broken windows, it doesn't encourage people to clean up and be civil. Whereas if there's beauty, it does have an impact on us. Is that, if you look at just taking a step back, last question, on the state of the world, to what extent do we need more beauty in our world?
Right now we live in a very ugly world. I think the people are, I'm going to make some broad brushing claims, that people tend to be lonely, anxious, alienated, right?
The studies show over and
over, right? There's more depression. People are more, the combination, I think, of the digital world that we have created around ourselves that disconnects us from nature, disconnects us from each other, and then the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown, which seems to have really amplified some of those qualities. I think there's been a real disruption that is ongoing, and the desire, I think, to reconnect with nature, to reconnect with our emotions, and reconnect with each other is deep. And one vehicle for that is beauty. Beauty as art, as a way of something that intrinsically draws us in. And so I think we need beauty as much as ever, especially in the conditions we find ourselves now.
And if you go back to what you said earlier about the freedoms that one has, it strikes me, then this is my interpretation of what you said, is that we might be in a more constrained environment. And that actually can end up being a good thing for us to re-find our roots, as opposed to believing in limitless possibilities. That sort of excessive freedom, which ends up with urinals somehow. And we need to come back to some basics.
Some basics and basics of means of expression. So Philadelphia is a fantastic city for street art, right? There are murals in pretty much every part of the city. It's the largest open-air art gallery in the country. You can walk around.
Even more than Austin, Texas?
Even more than
Holy
Austin,
smokes.
Texas. I mean, there are between 4,000 and 5,000 murals in the city.
Wow.
And that's not even talking about just on every lamppost and abandoned wall, like all of this artistic just expression. And it's, I mean, we were talking about, great art cities like London, Paris, Florence earlier. But you can walk down a block and it can take you an hour if you stop and look at all of the stickers people have posted, all of the expressions of their political freedoms, or their desire for political freedom, or the expressiveness. I mean, it's extraordinary, this outpouring in public spaces from people who are not well known, but are doing this. And so I think that, in some ways, to me, is a reaction to this alienation, these ugly times we're in, that people need to express what they're feeling and what they would like, their aspirations as well.
So the message that I'm taking away from this, Professor Chatterjee, is that we also need to take the time to smell the roses, per se, observe our surroundings, and let that be good feedback to feed ourselves.
And so that also we've done some work on. It's this notion of slow looking, right? We are all in such, we live manic worlds.
Fast worlds,
right? It's like we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing this. And how do you slow down? And that, I think, is a skill, it's a habit, right? And that you need to learn it. So we've done experiments getting people to look at one work of art for 15 minutes. And how do you do that? How do you give them some structure to do that? And we find that when people do that, if given the means to do it, their experience of the art becomes more profound, that they're more engaged, that they just get more out of it. So one way of thinking about this is art in this context is this a vehicle more generally to what you're saying is, can we slow down? Can we be present, right? Can we live in the now without living in our immediate past and our immediate future? I mean, that has to be done, but we need to be able to sort of switch gears when we're thinking about the past or thinking about the future, but also be present in the now. And that's something I think many of us in the world we live in have lost. And this kind of engagement, slow engagement with art, is maybe a way to recover something that's deeply human, of being present.
Beautiful last words. So I know you're writing a new book. Well, tell us, well, first of all, how can anybody get your current book, find out more about your reading, and can you give us a mic drop hint about the new book?
So so I'm at the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics, and if you do a search on that, you'll find what we're doing. You'll find links to papers we've published. I also write a blog in Psychology Today that takes most of our academic work and presents it in a not technical language. So
good for me.
Well, good for anyone who. I mean, it's a good exercise for us to try to write our science in a way that someone who is not a scientist can understand and really get what the point is. So I think that's all available. I think the book where we started talking about this, The Aesthetic Brain, is available in most platforms and so on.
I'll put all the show notes.
Yeah,
of course.
The book I'm working on right now addresses some of these issues that we've been talking about, and it really is centered around a notion of the mismatch. It's called the mismatch hypothesis, which is that our brains evolved in a certain time, mostly the Pleistocene, about 1.8 million years ago, and the features of our brain were selected to adapt to certain kinds of environment. And in the last 10 or 12,000 years since we became domesticated, especially the last 200 years, especially the last 50 years, especially the last 10 years, we have created an environment around ourselves. This is of our own making, an environment that is not what our brain was designed to flourish in. And so it's part diagnostic to say, here is a problem that we have created, and what are the ways of getting ourselves out of it? And underneath that, it's a biologic argument that what we have done has really disrupted the core of our biology in a way that, like all living organisms, we have a homeostatic range, that we need to exist in this to flourish, and we have pushed ourselves to the edge where we have very little reserve, and so we are triggered constantly. And so the broader idea is there are these big political and cultural assaults that we're all experiencing. Part of our inability to deal with many of those is because our biology is already pushed in a direction based on what we have created. And if we can recover ourselves back, I'm not telling people, it's not prescriptive in the sense that this is what you should do because of all of the injustices in the world, but this is what you should do so that you have the reserve to deal with it in however you think is correct.
Because this is brittle.
Yes, exactly.
We're about to break.
Right.
Beautiful.
So
well, mismatch. Watch this space.
Yeah.
Professor Chatterjee. Thank
Real
you so
pleasure.
much. My pleasure.
Yeah.